Staff Sergeant Sophie Bennett was the Army's most requested photographer. For 8 years at Fort Bragg, she documented everything from training exercises to official ceremonies. But when her camera equipment was examined after a routine security check, investigators made a discovery that changed everything. Sophie's memory cards contained thousands of files, but not a single one was a photograph. The investigation that followed would reveal a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. Sophie Bennett arrived at Fort Bragg in March 2011, fresh out of advanced individual training for military photography. At 22 years old, she possessed the technical skills and artistic eye that made her an immediate asset to the base's public affairs office. Her portfolio from training school showcased landscapes, portraits, and action shots that demonstrated real talent behind the camera. Her commanding officer, Major Patricia Williams, was impressed from day one. Sophie approached every assignment with professionalism and enthusiasm. She volunteered for additional duties, worked overtime without complaint, and consistently delivered what appeared to be high-quality documentation of base activities. Which city in the world are you watching this video from today? Please subscribe and support us for more stories. Her reputation grew steadily throughout 2012 and 2013. Base Commander specifically requested Sophie for sensitive assignments because of her discretion and reliability. She never gossiped about what she witnessed, never asked inappropriate questions, and always submitted her work through proper channels without trying to peek at classified materials. Sophie's equipment bag became a familiar sight around Fort Bragg. She carried professional-grade cameras, multiple lenses, lighting equipment, and backup memory cards everywhere she went. The bag was heavy, easily 40 pounds when fully loaded, but Sophie never complained about the weight or asked for assistance carrying it. Her work ethic was extraordinary. Sophie documented change of command ceremonies, training exercises, family events, and routine base operations with equal dedication. She was present at early morning PT sessions and late-night security briefings. Her calendar was constantly full, and she rarely took leave time. By 2014, Sophie had become more than just a photographer. She was practically part of Fort Bragg's infrastructure. New personnel were introduced to her as the photographer who captures everything. Major Williams noticed that Sophie's submitted photographs were consistently excellent, but she rarely saw Sophie reviewing her work or discussing technical aspects of photography with other personnel. When asked about her process, Sophie would give brief professional responses about composition and lighting, but never elaborated on her artistic choices or creative vision. This seemed unusual for a photographer with Sophie's apparent talent and dedication. Most artists enjoyed discussing their craft, sharing techniques, and critiquing their own work. Sophie treated photography like a technical job rather than a creative pursuit. But her results spoke for themselves. The photographs Sophie submitted were sharp, well-composed, and perfectly captured the essence of military life at Fort Bragg. Her work appeared in base publications, official reports, and promotional materials. She had documented hundreds of events and thousands of personnel over 4 years of service. In 2015, Sophie received a commendation for her photography work during a joint training exercise with international forces. The event required extensive documentation for diplomatic and training purposes, and Sophie's photographs were praised by both American and foreign military officials for their professionalism and quality. The commendation ceremony was itself photographed by Sophie, creating what Major Williams jokingly called a photograph of the photographer being honored for photography. Sophie accepted the recognition with characteristic humility and immediately returned to work, documenting the next day's activities. Her access to sensitive operations continued expanding throughout 2015 and 2016. Sophie was present during classified briefings when visual documentation was required. She accompanied special operations units during training exercises. She documented equipment tests that involved experimental military technology. Sophie's security clearance was upgraded twice to accommodate her expanding role. Each background check revealed the same profile: a dedicated, reliable service member with no red flags or concerning associations. Her financial records showed modest spending consistent with her military salary. Her personal relationships were minimal but appropriate. She lived alone in base housing and spent most of her free time maintaining her equipment or reviewing base photography assignments. Major Williams occasionally wondered if Sophie might be too dedicated to her work. She rarely socialized with other personnel, turned down invitations to off-base events, and seemed to have no interests outside of military photography. But dedication wasn't a negative trait in a soldier, and Sophie's work quality never suffered. The first sign that something might be unusual came in early 2017. During a routine equipment inventory, Specialist Rodriguez from the supply office noticed that Sophie requested replacement memory cards more frequently than other photographers. She went through twice as many cards as expected, given the number of photographs she submitted. When asked about this discrepancy, Sophie explained that she took many practice shots and test exposures that weren't suitable for official submission. She also mentioned that she kept detailed backup copies of important events to ensure nothing was lost due to equipment failure. The explanation was reasonable, and no further questions were asked. Sophie's photography assignments became even more sensitive in 2017 and 2018. She documented meetings between senior military officials and civilian contractors. She was present during discussions about base security upgrades and personnel changes. She captured images during visits from intelligence officials who rarely allowed their presence to be recorded. Her reputation for discretion made her the obvious choice for these assignments. Sophie never displayed curiosity about the content of meetings she documented. She set up her equipment, took the required photographs, and left without lingering or asking questions. By 2018, Sophie had access to more classified information and sensitive operations than many officers with decades of service. Her camera had been present during hundreds of restricted briefings, sensitive conversations, and confidential meetings. Major Williams, who had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, began to see Sophie as indispensable. Planning any significant event at Fort Bragg automatically included arranging for Sophie's photography services. Her work had become part of the base's official record, and her presence was expected at every important function. The routine security check that changed everything occurred in January 2019. New regulations required periodic examination of electronic equipment used by personnel with high-level security clearances. Sophie's equipment was selected for inspection along with computers, phones, and other devices used by cleared personnel. Instead, they found something impossible to explain. Sophie's memory cards contained thousands of files exactly as expected. But when technicians attempted to view the files, they discovered that none of them were photographs. The files had the correct naming conventions and file sizes that would be expected from digital photographs, but they couldn't be opened or displayed by any standard image viewing software. Further analysis revealed that the files weren't corrupted photographs. They were data files disguised to look like photographs. Each file contained text, numbers, and coded information that had nothing to do with visual imagery. The security team immediately contacted digital forensics specialists to examine Sophie's equipment more thoroughly. What they discovered over the following week defied explanation and raised questions that would take months to answer. Sophie's cameras had been modified with custom firmware that allowed them to function as sophisticated data recording devices while maintaining the appearance of standard photography equipment. When Sophie appeared to be taking photographs, she was actually recording audio conversations, GPS coordinates, timestamps, and detailed notes about everything she witnessed. For 8 years, Sophie had been compiling a comprehensive intelligence database disguised as a photography portfolio. Every photograph she had taken was actually a detailed surveillance report documenting sensitive military operations, classified conversations, and confidential personnel information. The scope of information Sophie had collected was staggering. Her files contained details about security procedures, personnel movements, equipment specifications, and operational plans that spanned nearly a decade of Fort Bragg activities. She had recorded conversations between high-ranking officers, documented classified meetings, and compiled detailed profiles of hundreds of military personnel. Most disturbing was the realization that Sophie's surveillance had been completely undetected for 8 years. She had been present at the most sensitive events on base, trusted with access to classified information, and treated as a reliable member of the team while secretly documenting everything for unknown purposes. The investigation into Sophie's activities immediately became a matter of national security. Counterintelligence specialists were brought in to assess the potential damage and determine whether Sophie was working alone or as part of a larger operation. Sophie was quietly transferred to a different assignment, pending the outcome of the investigation. Her departure from Fort Bragg was explained as a routine reassignment, and her photography duties were temporarily distributed among other personnel. Counterintelligence officers faced the challenge of determining Sophie's motivations and connections without alerting potential accomplices to the investigation. Was she a foreign agent who had infiltrated the military? Was she working for a domestic intelligence agency conducting unauthorized surveillance? Or was she acting independently for personal reasons? The answer came from an unexpected source. Hidden within Sophie's data files were references to her brother, Marine Captain David Bennett, who had been killed in Afghanistan in 2010. David's death had occurred under circumstances that the military had classified and never fully explained to his family. Sophie's surveillance activities at Fort Bragg appeared to be part of a personal investigation into her brother's death. She had been systematically documenting military operations, collecting intelligence on personnel who might have been involved in the Afghan mission, and building a case to uncover the truth about what had happened to David. Her 8 years of photography work had been a cover for an elaborate private investigation conducted from within the military system. Sophie had used her access and trust to gather information that she believed would eventually lead her to answers about her brother's death. The revelation reframed the entire investigation. Sophie wasn't a foreign spy or domestic threat. She was a grieving sister who had spent nearly a decade trying to solve the mystery of her brother's death, using the resources and access available to her as a military photographer. But the method she had used and the information she had collected still represented serious security breaches that couldn't be overlooked. Sophie had violated numerous regulations, compromised classified information, and conducted unauthorized surveillance on military personnel for 8 years. The case presented an unprecedented challenge for military justice. Sophie's motivations were understandable and even sympathetic, but her actions had potentially compromised national security and violated the trust placed in her by hundreds of military personnel. The investigation concluded in late 2019, with Sophie accepting a discharge under other than honorable conditions in exchange for cooperation with security officials and agreement never to disclose the classified information she had collected. Sophie Bennett left Fort Bragg quietly, just as she had arrived 8 years earlier. The base's photography duties were redistributed, and new security procedures were implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future. But the thousands of files Sophie had compiled during her years as Fort Bragg's photographer remained under lock and key, representing one of the most extensive unauthorized intelligence collections in military history. The woman who had never taken a single photograph had instead created the most detailed surveillance record of a military installation ever compiled by a single individual. And somewhere in those files might have been the answers about her brother's death that Sophie had spent 8 years trying to find.